This week, the National Park Service trek takes a sharp turn to the west. Did you know there's a park on the Oregon coast depicting the Lewis and Clark Salt Works? I'll be talking about them today. Located in the town of Seaside, Oregon on Tillamook Head, yes, like the cheese, but the cheese is named after the place, which is named after the people, the Tillamook, who lived there when Lewis and Clark arrived on the scene in the winter of 1805 and 1806. After being moved off that land in 1850, the Tillamook and other associated tribes were able to reclaim rights to a portion of this land by the Grand Ronde Reservation Act in 1988, with some annoying financial conditions. But the spot is identified by a combination of a stone cairn, a stacked rock marker, and the testimony of a member of the Tillamook tribe who had been born in the area in 1816 and had been told by her father that this was the place white men had made salt. Now, this admittedly is one of those National Park Service sites where one pulls off the road, parks the car, and it's just, well, there. In this case, surrounded by salal, because that's what grows there. It's pretty much the West Coast twin to the East Coast wild sea roses, by the way. And it's ringed by a protective fence. And this one's even a little extra fun since the spot now finds itself inside a suburban seaside neighborhood. But the salt works is also within sight of the sea. At first it feels close, but when you think about how far that really is, when you'd be constantly hauling seawater up, well, it's not that close. But it's also likely as close one wanted to get considering the December and January storms of the Oregon coast and the rickety shelter these men likely had built. And this spot was, among other things, chosen for the easy access to the water. It had a nice flat beach. And plenty of pines and firs grew there, which were necessary for the month-and-a-half-long fire they required. Unlike many of the sprawling parks and reserves I've highlighted, the Lewis and Clark Salt Works is just a spot, one that sits there, asking you to use your imagination to envision how the surroundings have changed in the 200-plus years since their visitation. But it's certainly the type of place you should poke your head into while visiting the wide vistas of the Oregon coast. And also, while you're about it, poke about in your area and the nps.gov site as a way to look for state and local locations of these little pocket parks that anchor pivotal moments in time. Episode 98, A Thirst for Salt. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the role of salt in war and adventure during these eventful early years of America. Salt was considered an essential supply, right up there with gunpowder. And while one sometimes stood in for the other, only one was replaceable on the road. To hear all about salt, its importance, and how early Americans used their salt, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that while modern Americans mostly eat more salt than we need to get by, for most of us it's not a huge problem. As a water-soluble chemical, the excess just washes out. Sure, there are people for whom it's an issue, but in reality that's a tiny, tiny number. So have a drink of water because that's easy these days. Hooray! And don't worry about it. In these early years of war and adventure, on the other hand, not enough salt was a problem for our hard-working, long-walking, and hard-fighting early Americans. See, our bodies need electrolytes, dissolved salt ions, for lots of things, short-term and long. We need it to build our enzymes for digestion. It's essential for our nerves to talk to our muscles. When people go into shock, cellular pores open willy-nilly and their body's fluids get all out of salt balance. I mean, their heart literally doesn't know how to beat correctly because signals can't be sent or received effectively. And the ions from a variety of salts also make sure all of our connective proteins are there to literally hold our bodies together, skin to muscle to bone. As long as animals eat an assortment of plants and minerals, or carnivores eat animals that eat these things, they're generally fine. Those stops by salt-bearing rocks and a few gulps of seawater or salty springs or a mouthful of salty dirt now and then can help keep things in line. Humans as omnivores fall easily into these categories of being able to get much of their necessary salts from what we eat anyway, with a few judicious additions, except when we insist upon motion with strange purposes. To acquire stuff beyond any conceivable future need, to fight beyond immediate local victory, and to range far beyond where we live, just out of curiosity and return. It is during these activities, long war, long travel, and long adventure, that salt becomes important in new ways. Here in the 21st century, we think of salt as flavor, but in early America, salt was survival. Because here's a funny thing about meat preservation in the ages before mechanical refrigeration. There's two main ways to do it, and neither is particularly compatible with long war or fast adventure. The first and most common way in much of the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, was to keep your meat on the hoof, so to speak. Always fresh and handy. Have herds of livestock and only eat what you harvest when you harvest it. By the time we're in the 17th century and forward, most people, except for fishing cultures, were not generally hunting. It was an entertainment or an extra, not the regular way most people got their meat, unless they were really wild and sort of on the fringes of the world. Instead, most people were working from a grain-based diet. Wheat, rye, oats, and the like, with beans, peas, onions, in-season vegetables, and occasional meat toppings. More meat, of course, as one ascended the greasy pole of society, but that still tended to be herded meat, or at least meat from the forests and ponds one owned. Yes, there is some smoking and potting of meat, but this only expended meat life for a few weeks, and more importantly, expected the consumer to have a nice, convenient pantry or smoking nook to work with. One was living near or with their meat animals, and they were dependably to hand. But as Europe went to sea, the brining of meat, especially pork and beef, became all the rage. But these heavy barrels of brined brawn again assumed the consumer would be on a boat or in a fort, and would have the requisite iron pots, fuel, and time to properly prepare the food. And it was in this brine meat that the initial source of the thirst for salt our new Americans had. Barreled meat in salty brine was basically frozen in time, and compared to the smoked meat of the fireplace nook, it was pretty fast to make and generally portable. Both kinds of meat had to be butchered from the same source, so there was no real time difference there. But the smoked meat took weeks to reach a preserved smokiness, and when removed from its nook, it was in danger of once again being attacked as one cut off chunks for dinner. Brined meat, once salted for a few days and dunked in the appropriate brine, could move anywhere the sound barrel could go, and as long as the remaining meat was weighted down and kept under the brine, taking out some for use didn't endanger the rest. Well, in theory anyway. And it wasn't just meat. A fair number of vegetables could be subjected to salty brine and travel along as well. Versions of sauerkraut and pickles went this way, even if the vinegar pickle was the preferred manner, as it took less skill. And of course, salted cheeses and salted butter were ways to preserve dairy far beyond the short life of fluid milk. In the livestock-keeping old world, salt was allowing people to range further from their farms and to maintain more food further from its season. And this is where nearly all the salt that was subject to all of those taxes and fights through all those years went. Salt went into preservation and survival, not adjusting the taste of one's pottage just so. So not being able to afford the salt tax could easily determine whether a person would have enough provisions to make it through cruel February and the hungry spring, when the last of the stored provisions were running out and the new food of the new year had yet to arrive. So no wonder anger about salt taxes could run so high and salt pirating was common. As I've mentioned a bunch, our 16th through 18th century Europeans were really a bunch of homebodies, and even when they traveled, they generally expected to spend the night indoors at an inn or in a tavern or in a religious house, or of course under the roof of a relative or some other connection. And when that wasn't going to be possible, They brought the indoors along with them. The baggage trains of armies, traveling kings, queens, dignitaries, and nobles are always nonsensically large to us modern people. Why are they bringing a bed they reassemble each night and disassemble each day for travel with a feather mattress and a regular coverlet, along with their chair and their wardrobe and their braziers? I mean, yes, wealth flex, absolutely, but also for the most part, there was little idea of portable. You just brought the house or castle or manor or cottage along. Europeans had largely stopped the nomadic life, and as societies had chosen the path of staying put. Or maybe they just had like multiple houses or castles or whatever they traveled to. So in the end, between keeping meat on the hoof in herds or flocks or whatever close at hand until it was needed, and all the preserved food was the type that wasn't hauled around easily, this is how they came up with their preferred preserving methods. But that's not the way things went in the Americas, the New World, from the point of view of our new Americans and their progenitors, which brings us to the second big way to preserve meat and some vegetable matter. The method of choice in the Americas was a slow sort of par cooking and drying of the meat, with or without smoke, depending on one's latitude or altitude. We wander back for a moment to the 16th century to the far south, and then up the sides of the Andes with a bunch of overdressed Spanish conquistadors clanking up vertigo-inducing trails suffering from all manner of hardships, including hunger, malaria, and maybe the chronic discomfort of a venereal disease or two. These men were eating a strange combination of hunted meat and rapidly depleting ship's stores. I mean, after the easier targets of the coastal people on the east coast of Central America, the Spanish felt the need to go to the west coast and get in trouble over there as well. Those adventures definitely had to do with their reach out to the Philippines, the spice trade out in the Indian Ocean archipelago, and dreams of China as well. But yeah, it was time to add montane landscapes to their It's New Spain set. So they started climbing mountains and harassing people in areas we now name Peru, Bolivia, and maybe a little bit in Ecuador and Colombia. And in this climbing, they were left with a food conundrum. Hunting could be chancy because it always ran the danger of stirring up the local big cat life. And the salted meats from the ship could only go so far and were frankly not delicious. So there was a great interest in this dried meat substance, what was called charqui by the local Quechua languages. It could be gnawed raw on the trail at need, but was also a pretty tasty addition to stews or even the parched corn mushes on the march. This charqui was typically made from the local grazing animals, guanacos, llamas, and alpacas, but could be made from any matter of critter caught. First, most of the fat was stripped off and consumed immediately for food or other uses, and the meat was cut into thin, cross-grain strips. These were alternately dried in the bright, high-altitude sun and then treated to freezing at night. After a few days of sunlight and freezing temperatures in the dry, high-altitude air, these strips of meat were all but impervious to invasion by flies, worms, and the less visible forms of rot. In some areas, these strips of meat might be further smoked, where there was adequate wood, or rubbed with spices, notably powdered dried chilies, to make them even more long-lasting. And as mountain people, salt was not available in quantity. These Spanish explorers, having sailed over and hiked on diets of salt pork, salt beef, and salt fish, supplemented by wild kills that rapidly went rancid, this charqui, or as it would get laundered through any number of European languages, jerky, was a wonderful discovery. While it seems there were possibly some dried meat preparations in the southern Mediterranean at this age, they were small-scale produced fine foods and not soldiers' rations. But jerky definitely was. So as Europeans made inroads into the Americas, versions of thin-cut, dried, and sometimes smoked and spiced meats would come to their notice. This preparation used little or no salt, but was also incredibly time-consuming to prepare and depended on dry weather conditions. In the pemmican episode 84, I talked about how traditional pemmican was made by completely and painstakingly disassembling the hunted bison or antelope. It was the same deal with the charqui. The best air-dried stuff took time, and additions of smoke or spice or other ingredients took even more. As I was looking into these two methods for meat preservation last week, thinking about old school versus new school dried cod, these were really different. With the cod, it was just sort of higher and lower quality. But what was going on here with these two different ways of preserving meat? The barreled salted meat versus the jerky, and the more incredible pemmican. These two ways were completely different. They had two completely divergent philosophies of meat preservation. Why had this developed? So I kept poking around. My first thought was, well, the desert peoples of Africa, did they have habits of dried meat? Or how about the Mongols? They lived in high, dry climates with little salt and few trees. How about them? And for the most part, the answer is no. Why? Herds. Most cultures in this old world either had herds of animals or partnerships with other people who had herds of animals, so they would keep their meat alive on the hoof until it was time to consume it. So there was not really much need to preserve meat for the long haul. But in the Americas, except for a few small animals like cuy, that is guinea pig, and turkeys, the idea of pastoral living in the pre-Columbian days, that is, keeping herds of animals and traveling about with them, was not a common way of life, but a nomadic one was. Depending on the part of the Americas one lived in, there would be a fishing camp, a farming camp, and a hunting camp, maybe a winter camp. And these were all hunting cultures. Meat just sort of came when it did, not when people decided it was time to harvest a herd animal that was just close at hand. And meat might come in wild overabundance, so care would have to be taken to preserve it to cover the times of shortage. But unlike potting or barreling, it needed to be done in ways that were portable, compatible with a mobile lifestyle. So dried meat, jerky, and that fat-wrapped dried meat, pemmican, they can come along for the ride or can be cached in dry locations as well. And it's amenable to lower prep meals at the eating end. So much work has been put into this meat, whether in strips or ground up, it makes a relatively fast meal on the trail, especially where cooking tools may be limited and cooking fuel may be uncertain. The Spanish, they were extremely chuffed with this idea and so brought the idea of charqui or jerky back with them. And they spread the idea of dried beef as a food across their own arid plains. Now, as you might guess, this method never really made its way to damp England or well-watered France or the tree-covered lands of Prussia that were to become Germany. But as the English and others showed up in America, they were quite taken with this habit of dried strips of meat. I spoke a bit of the pemmican jerky line back in episode 84, that the high places with bright cold days and freezing cold nights were essential for the freeze-dried, par-cooked style of meat needed for charqui and pemmican. And this was made up for in warmer and moister places with more regular use of smoking. For Americans supplying wars and adventures, these traditional methods were just too slow, and one way to speed up the drying was salting, rubbing the strips of meat with salt. Now, this makes a different product than the traditional jerkies, but it didn't depend so heavily on dry weather and so much time. And even when the salted American jerky got wet, it resisted going rancid, unlike the traditional stuff. It also allowed for thicker pieces and allowed the Americans to stick to their preference for cutting with the grain of the meat, which is easier than the highly skilled and tedious technique of cutting across the grain. Cutting across the grain, though more difficult and requiring higher skill and more time, does create short muscle fibers that dry faster, take up smoke and spices better, and are easier to pound into edible shreds. Cutting with the grain creates long fibers, and it depends more on salt to draw the water out. It's also harder to eat. The long fibers may be hard to chew into swallowable bits, and they definitely get stuck in your teeth. If you ever nibble on modern beef jerky snacks, you can easily feel the experience of the cross grain versus the with the grain pieces. And you know which ones are your favorite and which ones have you searching for a toothpick or dental floss. So here we are in the 18th century. Salt is an absolute must for our warring and exploring and generally in a hurry Americans. Powdering tubs are an absolute essential on any farm and in any slaughterhouse, for this is where butchered meat is powdered or covered in salt as a preliminary step for barreling it up with brine. The idea of jerky is appealing, but its traditional long, slow preparation is a frustrating mystery to most Americans, so they almost always purchase it from tribes along with pemmican. No real American jerky style develops at this point, though long hunters and explorers will salt the meat they shoot to keep it a bit longer, in a less appealing, quick salted jerky style. Smoking, of course, is sometimes added, but mostly remains on farms with the production of country smoked hams and smokehouse sausages. For men at war, salt was important, but wasn't generally issued as part of the general ration. In the Revolutionary War rule created by George Washington for the Continental troops, salt wasn't generally issued on its own since salt meat generally was. So meat added to soups or stews or pottages would bring along plenty of salt, even after the rinsing. Salt would be issued to bakers and be brought along by officers' cooks, but the ubiquity of salt meat and salt and vinegar pickled vegetables made issuing salt generally unnecessary, most of the time. But when men were on the march or kept from a reasonable camp and living off of game or forage, that was when salt was most wanted. So of course it was even harder to get. But gunpowder, the black powder of the day, was made of sodium and potassium nitrate, that is saltpeter, mixed with charcoal and just a bit of sulfur. Now, charcoal is non-toxic. In fact, it's given to people who have ingested poisons as a way of absorbing poisons and flushing it from people's systems. And humans can ingest sulfur in small amounts with no harm. Same with saltpeter, and it has a salty, though bitter taste. So more than one soldier who has been faced with yet another bowl of sodden, tasteless, and possibly cold corn mush made from parched corn and stream water, unable to choke it down on the trail, despite being incredibly hungry and damp and tired, has turned to his cartridges, or powder horn, for a dash of black gunpowder to liven up the meal. Just a little. Now, this isn't the sort of thing one finds in cookbooks. Instead, it lives in letters home and in journals and the complaints and laments of commanding officers as powder stores are reduced for the purpose of flavoring food. So while there are instances of maybe rock salt being used as ammunition as a deterrence here and there, salt is never going to replace gunpowder. But on more than one occasion, gunpowder has stood in for salt when things were particularly dire. And gunpowder was never going to be able to stand in for salt as a preservative. And the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark's crew, they knew that. As they crossed the Continental Divide at the Bitterroot Mountains in what is now Idaho and Montana in the fall and early winter of 1805, the expedition was out of salt. As they trekked through the trail and pass known as Lolo, they had to move along swiftly in their bid to outrun the heaviest winter snows, and too quickly to stop and hunt, much less dress out and prepare meat for travel. So they were reduced to eating rancid elk meat and whatever scraps of sustenance they had on hand. They knew they had to make it to the far coast to rest for the winter and replenish their stores for the return trip. This meant they needed to hunt a large surplus of meat and dry it for travel, as well as prepare hides to replace and repair lost and worn gear. Their plans for providing adequate powder and shot had worked out, Though Seaman, Lewis's large Newfoundland dog, did his part to bring down rabbits and some other small game, and they also had traps, a few spears, and plenty of purchased meat from villages and hunters they encountered along the way. But to go home, to make it back, they needed to prepare meat and hides for travel in this damp Oregon winter. And to prepare the meat and hides for travel in that damp Oregon winter, especially with the time and skills they had, they needed salt. Gallons of it. Their main camp, Fort Clatsop, named again for the people already there, was on the Columbia River and back from the sea. Again, not a bad idea considering the winter storms of the northwest coast, but the river proved to be only brackish, getting some seawater washing up it at high tides. And when one is chopping the wood to evaporate the salt, the saltier the water one starts with, the better. So 3 men from the expedition were detailed to head down to a sheltered spot on the coast where they could get seawater, but also they had to build a boiling kiln to make salt from the sea. And to get the saltiest water, they went around the corner south of the modern Point Adams from the mouth of the Columbia to get all the way away from all of that diluting water from that giant river. So though it was hard exposed work, at least there was always a warm fire, and the men drying the salt were able to eat a fair bit of fatty whale meat because at least one whale beached while they were at this work. And once the members of the expedition had adjusted to the return of fat to their diet after nearly perishing of starvation during their crossing of the Bitterroots, fatty whale meat and straight-up fried blubber were extremely welcome, especially since these people were almost entirely heating themselves from within in the damp 40-ish degree Oregon winter. That's about 4°C. They took a 17-mile trek with the expedition's 5 largest kettles and built up more or less a rock stove for boiling the water. 9 days later, they had made a gallon of salt and returned to a grateful and jubilant camp. And then the salting of meat and hides for the return journey could at last commence. In all, these 3 men collected around 1,400 gallons of water. That's about 5,600 liters and as many kilos. Or for us still stuck in the English system, that's about 12,000 pounds of water. And after collecting, all of this water would be left to settle for several hours to keep the sand content in the salt to a minimum, and then the water would be poured off and boiled. Over the course of about a month and a half, these men made about 28 gallons of salt. 12 of the gallons were placed in kegs for the return journey, and the rest was used in preparing meat and hides. In the damp Oregon winter, the salt was essential for drawing moisture out of the animal tissues. To try and dry skins for tanning or to prepare meat for travel without salt would have been impossible in that winter season. In fact, hands down, the most surprising thing I've learned delving into this particular American adventure is just how much time of the expedition was spent drying out. From capsized boats and canoes, from horse-pack loads being dislodged by frightened swimming horses, from the crew being pummeled by a passing downpour, and from trails they were following changing from packed snow to sucking slushy swamps. So while we think of salty foods leading to thirst and the need for a drink of water, the Corps of Discovery, along with all the foot soldiers walking all over this startlingly large continent in linen, leather, and wool, as they faced the perils of the damp, they all had a powerful thirst for salt and all it could do to help things dry out or at least staunch the rot. Next week, as we travel through this particularly adventurous and belligerent period of our past, it's time to scooch up the social ladder and check out the fancy food of the merchant impressing clients and the officer's mess, as opposed to the enlisted men. It's time for rice. Here in the modern world, it's a machine-made product, and not particularly more or less dear than, say, wheat or corn or oats. But at the time we're looking at, this hand-pounded grain of delicate form, was a way to show you had made it, and you had a good cook. Thanks for listening, and thanks to everyone for being patient with this episode out a day late or so. Life will do that to you sometimes. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Please go ahead and leave a review. Your voice matters too. As part of an exclusive crowd, you can get the word out if you're enjoying the trip. With the way social media world is fracturing and changes in my own personal world, I'm not so active out there these days, but when I do pop up, it'll be on Threads and Instagram as THoAFood. If you'd like to explore history in some different ways, I'm out there in new incarnations. On November 4th, I'm back at Intelligent Speech Online, and tickets are out there now. You can find the conference at intelligentspeechonline.com, and there's a link to the website and a place to buy tickets in the show notes. For more fun and a dash of the ridiculous, come check out Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters as we dig into the 19th century through modern media depictions of the period. Right now, we are on the crazy ride of Warrior Season 1, almost to the season finale. Cool fights. And after that, there'll be some movies and some stuff, and we'll get back pretty quickly to Season 2. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. Links and all this information, as always, are in the show description.